She left with a smile and a shopping list. That was it, nothing grand, nothing suspicious. Just Sophie, standing by the front door in her soft blue sweater, with a glance over her shoulder and that sweet curve of her lips that still disarmed me after 15 years. "I won't be long," she said, waving the little notepad in her hand. "Just picking up the usual." Jack nodded, watching from the kitchen doorway as she slipped her shoes on. She looked like she always did before a quick trip, calm, poised, slightly distracted by thoughts of what to cook that night. He didn't question it. He never had to. Their life had settled into one of quiet familiarity, a rhythm of routines: Thursday grocery runs, Sunday breakfast on the porch, the occasional movie night when they both remembered. That day, the house was unusually still after the door shut behind her. Jack cleaned the mugs from their morning coffee, fed the cat, and returned to his computer to finish some freelance design work. At first, he didn't even notice how much time had passed. It wasn't until the light shifted through the blinds and the kettle whistled again, this time without Sophie there to turn it off, that a quiet discomfort began to stir in his chest. He checked his phone. No messages. Half an hour passed. Then 45 minutes. She'd gone to the local grocer, just 10 minutes away. It wasn't unusual for her to take her time. Sophie liked to browse, to stop by the florist on a whim or run into an old friend and chat for 20 minutes. But today something felt different. Jack's unease bloomed slowly, like a dull headache. He told himself not to be ridiculous. Maybe she'd swung by the bakery for that sourdough she liked, or maybe there was a line at the checkout. But an hour came and went, and still, nothing. That's when he grabbed his keys. The store was quiet when he arrived. Familiar aisles. Familiar staff. But no Sophie. He wandered through the produce section, peered past the deli counter, scanned every face, hoping, expecting, until the knot in his stomach twisted tighter. She wasn't here. Not in the store. Not in the parking lot. That's when he started driving without really thinking. Something inside him pointed downtown. A strange intuition, like a whisper he couldn't ignore. And there she was. Sophie. On a weathered park bench 2 blocks down from Main Street. Laughing. Hair pulled back. Her lips pink from licking the swirl of ice cream they were sharing. And next to her, Tom. Jack had seen him once before, though they'd never been introduced. He looked comfortable, too comfortable, leaning in, saying something that made her throw her head back in laughter, like they had their own little world. The shopping list? Forgotten. The smile she left with? Now he saw it for what it really was, a lie dressed in sweetness. Jack drove home slower than usual, his knuckles pale around the steering wheel, his mind looping the same question over and over: why there? He hadn't made a scene. He hadn't even let Sophie know he'd seen her. From the safety of his parked car across the street, he watched just long enough to burn the image into his memory: her laughter, the way her hand brushed against Tom's, and the unmistakable intimacy of 2 people who shared more than ice cream. But now, the silence in the car pressed in on him, demanding answers he didn't yet have. Back in the house, everything was exactly as she'd left it. The folded grocery list still sat on the kitchen counter. Jack stared at it for a while, trying to remember what she'd said as she left. Something casual. "Do we need more olive oil?" she'd asked. It was almost laughable now. Of course, she never planned to go shopping. That list was a prop, one she'd probably written quickly that morning to make her story airtight. He sat down at the kitchen table, elbows resting on the polished wood, staring out the window but seeing nothing. The normalcy of their home mocked him. The kettle she used every morning, the coffee mugs they'd picked out together in a little shop on their honeymoon, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hall, each detail now felt like a betrayal in itself. For the first time in years, Jack began to wonder just how much of his marriage had been real. He opened his phone, thinking maybe there'd be a text, some kind of update to maintain the illusion. Sure enough, there it was. "Store was packed," she wrote. "Heading to the second market for the milk." The lie was smooth, even considerate. She knew he'd worry if she didn't check in. She was always so good at knowing what to say, what to do. And suddenly, Jack realized that her attentiveness had never been love. It was management. Control. Sophie's version of damage prevention. He clicked her message open, stared at the typing bubbles that had appeared and vanished twice before he finally responded with a simple, "Okay." Be safe. Safe from what, exactly? The irony twisted in his chest. Safe from traffic? From strangers? Or maybe from the consequences of being discovered? Jack didn't know what burned more, the thought that she was betraying him or the fact that she thought he'd never find out. He needed clarity, something tangible. He walked to the small drawer by the hallway mirror where they kept receipts and spare keys. He opened it, half expecting to find a clue. Of course, there was nothing unusual, except, perhaps, the absence of Sophie's usual handwritten receipt from the grocer. She had a habit of keeping them, filing them away by week and month, as if the paper trail gave her life structure. But not today. Today, there was no receipt. No bag of groceries. Just silence and that dreadful sense of something shifting beneath his feet. Jack went back to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the sink. He looked down at the list again. Eggs. Bread. Paper towels. All items they already had. And then he saw it, tucked into the margin, in Sophie's elegant script, almond butter, if time. A small, thoughtful detail, added not to deceive but to disarm. She had expected this lie to go undetected. The more he thought about it, the more the timeline unraveled. That impromptu second market would take her nowhere near downtown. There was no logical reason for her to be sitting in the shade of that old park, sharing a cone with Tom. No store nearby. No errand that justified her being there. And certainly no way to explain away the soft look in her eyes when she gazed at him. The weight of it settled on Jack like wet cement. He'd never been the jealous type, never had reason to be. Sophie had always been warm, if occasionally distant. But now, with every second that passed, he saw the patterns he'd overlooked. The extra 15 minutes on evening walks. The sudden interest in dressing up on grocery runs. The weekend errands that ended in her returning empty-handed but flushed and energized. All the signs had been there, hiding in plain sight, masked by routine and trust. Jack sat down again, this time pulling out his old leather notebook. He needed to write it out, not as evidence, not even as a record, but as a way to make sense of the fracture he now felt inside himself. On the first line he wrote, "She smiled when she left." And underneath it, "But the smile wasn't for me." He didn't cry. He didn't rage. But something fundamental inside him shifted, like a door quietly closing. The following afternoon felt heavier than most. Jack hadn't slept much the night before. He lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet tick of the bedside clock stretch into long, unbearable minutes. The echo of Sophie's laughter from the park kept replaying in his head. It was a kind of laugh he hadn't heard from her in years, unguarded, easy, intimate. Not the practiced, distracted smile she usually wore at home when he asked about her day. It didn't feel like something she borrowed for an afternoon. It felt like something she belonged to. He didn't say anything to her when she returned later that night. He had already erased his presence from the kitchen, from the hallway, from any part of the house where she might notice the crack in him. She came in carrying a small grocery bag, milk, a loaf of bread, and a jar of almond butter, neatly ticking off items on the list. He glanced at the bag only once and turned away, his expression unreadable. Sophie kissed him on the cheek, distracted, murmured something about long lines and bad parking. He nodded like he believed her, let her talk. But her words no longer registered as truth. They just filled the air like noise, a script she had rehearsed 1,000 times. Jack waited until she went upstairs to shower before slipping outside. He stood on the back porch, the night cool against his skin, and finally exhaled the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding all day. The next morning, Jack decided he needed more than suspicion. He needed certainty. He didn't want to be the kind of man who dismantled his life over a glance or a hunch. But he also wasn't going to live in a house built on lies. There was no sense in asking Sophie directly, he could already imagine her response. A soft, wounded voice. A hand on his chest. "Jack, what are you talking about?" she'd say. "You're overthinking again." He didn't want to hear the lie spoken out loud. He wanted the truth delivered in silence. He drove downtown, back to the same spot where he had seen them. It was a quiet street during the week, lined with boutique shops, a second-hand bookstore, a small florist, and a bakery that specialized in hand-rolled croissants. It wasn't a place Sophie had ever mentioned going. And yet, somehow, it made sense. It was the kind of charming, tucked-away neighborhood perfect for secret meetups. Public enough to seem innocent. Private enough to escape suspicion. Jack parked his car near the corner, sat back, and watched. For almost an hour, nothing happened. Just people walking their dogs, sipping coffee, laughing in pairs. It was almost enough to make him feel ridiculous. But then, like the world had conspired to confirm his worst fear, he saw her. Sophie. Wearing the same blue coat from yesterday, her hair tied back in the loose way she always wore it when she didn't expect to be seen. And there he was, Tom, again. Waiting for her on the same bench. They didn't embrace, but the familiarity between them was unmistakable. There was no nervousness in the way Sophie sat down beside him, no hesitation in the way she leaned toward him. Jack watched as she handed him a coffee cup and unwrapped a pastry from a brown paper bag. They laughed as they split it, sharing bites like it was their Saturday morning tradition. When Sophie licked icing off her finger and Tom reached over to wipe a crumb from her chin, Jack's stomach clenched. It wasn't just a fling. This wasn't the beginning of an affair, it was already well underway. What he saw wasn't clumsy or hesitant. It had rhythm, history. Sophie didn't look guilty. She looked at peace. He considered confronting them right then, walking across the street and shattering whatever illusion they'd built for themselves. But as he sat in the car, watching his wife with another man, a strange calm washed over him. He no longer needed confrontation to validate what he knew. The truth had already spoken. Loudly. Clearly. And it had spoken in the form of the casual way she brushed a hand through Tom's hair, or the way she laughed at something he said before resting her head briefly on his shoulder. Jack started the engine and drove away. Not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. He didn't want a screaming match or tears on the sidewalk. What was there left to say? She had made her choice long before today. All he had to do now was make his. When he returned home, Sophie wasn't back yet. He took his time packing. Not clothes or essentials, not yet. Just the things that mattered, the small framed photo of them on their wedding day, the handwritten anniversary card she gave him 7 years ago, the one that ended with, "Forever, no matter what." He stared at that line for a long time before placing it in a folder and sliding it into the desk drawer. He wouldn't throw it out. But it didn't mean anything anymore. Then, he sat at the kitchen table and wrote the note. He didn't rewrite it or read it twice. It was simple. Final. A single sentence. You thought dessert would be sweet. Now, all that's left is the aftertaste of betrayal. He left it on the counter beside the half-empty jar of almond butter. And then Jack walked out. Jack didn't go far. He didn't have a destination in mind when he left the house, but he knew he couldn't stay. His car rolled through familiar streets with unfamiliar stillness inside him. He passed the library where Sophie used to take her book club meetings, the cafe where they used to get Sunday morning scones. Every place was a piece of their history, but now each one held the echo of a lie, a shadow cast by something he'd only just begun to understand. He ended up by the lake. Not some scenic overlook or busy park, just a quiet turnout with a patch of gravel and a narrow view of the water through a break in the trees. The late afternoon sun glittered across the surface like glass shards. Jack turned off the engine, let the silence return, and sat for a long time without moving. He wasn't sure if he was numb or just emptied out completely. In the stillness, his thoughts slowed enough for a sharper truth to take shape, not just that Sophie had betrayed him, but that she had been quietly living a second life, one carved out in smiles, subtle exits, and innocent lies. The woman he'd thought he knew wasn't the one sitting on that bench with another man, sharing a cone like it was a ritual, not a secret. That was what cut the deepest, not the act itself, but how natural it all seemed to her. The casualness. The routine. The fact that she had created a whole emotional world outside their marriage, and he had only just caught up. The moment of realization didn't feel like a shattering. It felt like a settling. Like a heavy snowfall covering everything, dulling the edges of grief. Jack had spent years believing in Sophie's goodness, in the safety of their shared life. He trusted her without question, not because she asked for it, but because she'd earned it, or at least, he thought she had. Now, he saw how expertly she'd shaped the truth to suit her needs. Not dramatically, not cruelly, but with practiced, soft deceit. It was the kind of betrayal that didn't slam doors or leave lipstick stains. It whispered instead, quietly pulling him away from the center of her heart without him noticing. He didn't blame Tom, not really. The man wasn't innocent, he clearly knew Sophie was married, but he wasn't the architect of this collapse. Sophie was. She had constructed two realities and managed them both with a careful balance. But in trying to protect one, she had ultimately abandoned the other. She hadn't just betrayed Jack, she'd betrayed the version of herself she had once promised to be. Jack opened the glove compartment and pulled out an old notebook he used to keep for sketching designs. He flipped to a blank page and let the pen move, not to document details, but to process the emotional unraveling. His handwriting was slower than usual, uneven, but it steadied as the words came. I didn't lose her today. I just finally saw where she'd been gone for a long time. That truth settled deep. He thought back to the way she'd kissed him that morning, quick, distracted, like someone late to an appointment. He had mistaken it for routine, for comfort. But now, he saw it for what it was, detachment masked as normalcy. She'd perfected the art of keeping just enough connection to quiet his instincts, but never enough to truly meet him there anymore. Her gaze no longer lingered when they spoke. Her smile rarely reached her eyes. And her silence, once companionable, had grown into something colder, something filled with unspoken guilt. Jack closed the notebook and leaned back, staring at the sky as clouds rolled in slowly, casting shadows across the lake. He imagined the scene repeating itself again tomorrow, and the next day. Sophie slipping out the door with a different excuse, the same smile, and a mental note to bring home just enough to keep suspicion at bay. It wasn't a mistake. It was a rhythm. One he had been dancing to alone. The clarity didn't make the pain go away, but it gave it shape. And in that shape, Jack found the strength to accept something he'd never imagined. He was no longer part of her future. Maybe she hadn't said it outright, but her actions had been speaking for months. She had made her choice not in a single moment, but across a series of smaller ones. Every text she didn't send, every night she stayed out just a little too long, every empty "love you" spoken out of habit, not conviction. When he drove home, he didn't expect Sophie to be there, and she wasn't. The house was as quiet as it had been when he left it. The note he had left remained untouched on the counter, stark against the polished granite. He didn't add to it. There was nothing else to say. Instead, he walked through each room slowly, taking it in, not with anger, but with a sense of farewell. The kitchen where they had danced during power outages. The den where they used to watch old movies until they both dozed off. The upstairs hallway lined with framed memories that now felt like fiction. He stopped in their bedroom, the place where Sophie had once whispered dreams into his ear after midnight. Now it was just a room. A shell. And the echo of her betrayal lingered like perfume. Jack didn't touch the bed. He didn't pack. Not yet. He simply opened the window, let in the cool breeze, and stood there a moment longer, allowing himself to mourn what was real and what only felt real. The next morning, Sophie returned home with the ease of someone who believed everything was still intact. She set her keys down with a soft clink on the table by the door, humming a tune under her breath as she slipped off her shoes. The grocery bag swung gently from her hand, almost empty. Jack had noticed when he passed her car in the driveway. It was the same rhythm she'd followed for years, like muscle memory. But the house was different now. The silence had weight, like the air had shifted in her absence. She called his name once, casually, not out of worry but habit. When no response came, she walked into the kitchen, expecting to find him sipping coffee or hunched over his laptop. Instead, she found the counter bare, except for a single folded note. Her footsteps slowed as she approached it, her fingers hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Jack's. "You thought dessert would be sweet. Now, all that's left is the aftertaste of betrayal." She stood frozen, the words burning through her like acid. Her smile faded. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked around as if expecting him to step out from behind a door, to tell her it was a cruel joke, or maybe a warning. But the truth settled in fast, he knew. Somehow, he had seen what she thought she'd kept hidden beneath charm and routine. She sank into one of the chairs at the kitchen table, gripping the note with both hands. Her eyes moved over the line again and again, searching for more, for context, for a plea or an accusation. But it was just one sentence, carved cleanly from a truth she hadn't been ready to face. Jack wasn't confronting her. He wasn't starting a fight. He had simply walked away, and that made the silence deafening. Upstairs, their bedroom looked untouched. His clothes were still in the closet, his shoes neatly aligned, but the energy had drained from the space. The bed was made, the window cracked open to let in the morning breeze. It smelled like spring outside, fresh, alive, and yet the air inside was stale with everything unspoken. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed and stared at nothing. The cone she'd shared with Tom, the laughter, the bench, it all replayed in her mind, but now it felt warped. Not romantic. Not sweet. Just exposed. She had managed to keep two lives running parallel for months, convinced she could balance them without consequence. But Jack's quiet departure proved otherwise. He hadn't slammed doors or yelled. He had simply withdrawn all trust, all affection, in one quiet, irreversible step. Downstairs, her phone buzzed with a message from Tom, "Same time tomorrow?" She didn't answer. She set the phone down face first on the table and pushed it aside. Jack, meanwhile, drove along the coast, the windows down and the salt air rushing in. He wasn't thinking about what he'd left behind, he'd already grieved that. What lingered in him now wasn't anger or sadness, but clarity. Sophie had made a choice. So had he. There was dignity in walking away without drama, in not giving her the satisfaction of a confrontation. He wasn't interested in seeing her cry or hearing her rationalize the betrayal. Her silence on the park bench had said everything. He didn't know where he was going next, but that didn't scare him. The road was open. And this time, it would only move forward.